I should start by saying the last time I was in this building giving a talk on Blake, I went on for 75 minutes. I will not tax your attention for that long. I've got 20 minutes. So to start, before I dive into the copper plates, I'd like to present some historical context to begin with. In 1809, the antiquarian, first director of the Society of Antiquaries, Richard Goff, bequeathed his vast collection to the Bodleian Library. Included in this collection were the materials relating to his mammoth publication, Sepulchral Monuments in Great Britain, which was published between 1786 and 1796. Published in this particular volume. This particular volume contains engravings by James Bezier, and the engravings were made along with the preparatory drawings in the 1770s, between 1773 and 1779, 1780, which coincided with William Blake's apprenticeship. Now, before Blake became an apprentice to Richard Goff, he spent 4 years at Henry Pars's drawing school on the Strand. Now, the drawing school was seen as the most preeminent drawing school in London at the time, and it was considered a prerequisite to attending St. Martin's Academy, which was a precursor to the Royal Academy. So if you wanted to attend St. Martin's and then the Royal Academy, you would have to attend Pars's drawing school. Now, Blake demonstrated a precocious talent for drawing, so much so that his father, a hosier by trade, wanted to apprentice Blake to a painter of eminence. However, the fees involved for the apprenticeship were so much that Blake instead requested to be apprenticed to an engraver. Now, the first engraving master that Blake's father approached was a chap called William Wynne Ryland. When Blake was introduced to William Wynne Ryland, Blake reportedly said to his father, "I do not like that man's face. He will live to be hanged." 10 years later, William Wynne Ryland was convicted of forging East India Company bills and hanged by the neck at Tyburn. Some say Blake is a prophet and a visionary. Maybe this is the evidence for such things. Instead, Blake was apprenticed to James Bezier on the 4th of August, 1772, for the princely sum of £52. The apprenticeship involved spending 7 years living with the Bezier household. So he'd moved from his home in Poland Street to Bezier's studio in Great Queen Street, just near Lincoln's Inn. And here we have the documentation from the stationer's records in London, where you have William Blake signing away his life for 7 years at the tender age of 14, almost 15. Now, there is plenty of evidence we have for Blake and what he was doing during his apprenticeship. Some of this evidence is firsthand, that is, people who knew Blake, who worked with Blake or were friends with Blake during his life. So we can infer that they got this evidence from Blake directly. In particular, what happened in 1773 is that Blake was sent to Westminster Abbey to make a series of preparatory drawings of the medieval royal tombs and effigies and wall paintings that then were to be engraved for Goff's publication. And this is Bezier's studio in Great Queen Street. And this is a representation of the engraving studio. Now, as an apprentice, the first years would have involved some of the menial tasks like cleaning the studio, preparing the copper plates. But clearly, Blake was such a good draftsman that Bezier entrusted him, just 1 year into his apprenticeship, to go and make these preparatory drawings for this very significant publication of Goff's. We also have evidence that Blake, by 1773, could engrave. Now, what you're seeing here are the only 2 states of what we think of today, maybe this have to be revised after this talk, of Blake's earliest engravings. They are engravings after a figure from Michelangelo's The Death of the Crucifixion of St. Peter, from engraving by Francesco Salviati. Now, the one on your left contains an inscription that reads, "Engraved when I was a beginner at Bezier's," and then the later one actually gives us a date, "Engraved by W. Blake, 1773, from an old Italian drawing." The The state on the right is the later state, the second state. So it's the state on the left, which is the first state, which we can date to 1773. Now, the fascinating thing about this, by 1 year into his apprenticeship, Blake already had mastered the visual language of line engraving, that he could cover a copper plate with a series of linear patterns to recreate form, tone, and depth. In other words, by 1773, Blake could engrave. Now, when he went to Westminster Abbey, he spent between 1773 to possibly 1777 making a series of preparatory drawings. To give you a sense of where he was during this period, in 1774, he starts in the Confessor's Chapel. This is just behind the high altar, making drawings of the royal effigies and tombs. The following year, he moves onto the great Cosmati pavement in front of the high altar, faces to the north, and starts sketching the tombs of the recently revealed tombs of King Siebert, the supposed the original founder of Westminster Abbey, as well as the medieval wall paintings that were there. Now, these medieval wall paintings at the time were believed to have been executed by a contemporary of Giotto, a chap called Calvinati. He did an about turn to face the opposite direction and did a series of preparatory sketches of the other royal tombs on the other side of the Cosmati pavement, and then moved to St. Edmund's Chapel to sketch the tombs there. In total, he did over 50 drawings. Now, these drawings are all signed J. Bezier Del, in Latinate formula for delineating. He is the author of them. Now, this was commonplace practice for the master of the studio to sign any work coming out of the studio. And what I've been doing with John over the last year and a half is looking at both the drawings and the copper plates. Now, it's been accepted in Blake scholarship that many of these drawings are attributed to Blake because of the circumstantial evidence, and the 6 copper plates of the portraits of kings and queens have also been accepted as a tribute to Blake. So part of the investigation that we've been conducting is whether or not the other copper plates after Blake's preparatory drawings are also, or could also be attributed to Blake. So one of the first things we did, I asked John to do, was to use the Selene technology to look at the 6 oval copper plate portraits to see if we could find the consistencies in terms of the depth of lines that were etched in there. And what we found is, across all 6 copper plate portraits, there is a consistency of depth, roughly 80 microns deep, which is a quarter of the width of a human hair, so very shallow. And that's consistent across all 6 copper plates, which would suggest the same hand was responsible for the etching of these. Possible to press play. And we focused on particular areas of sort of densely hatched areas of under the eyes, around the ears. As I said, all of these measurements prove to be very consistent, which again suggests that the same hand is responsible for them. Again, all of the engravings that come from Bezir's studio are signed by him. Now, there are question marks over the rest of the engravings, in large part because the first volume of Sepulchral Monuments wasn't published until 1786, which is 7 years after Blake completes his apprenticeship. And there's also one engraving that bears the date 1783, which again would postdate Blake's involvement in this particular plate. However, we know from the Gough correspondence and his manuscript autobiography here in the Bodleian that he started working on this project in 1771 or 1772 and commissioned Bezir to start the process of making the preparatory drawings and the engravings in 1773. That's to say, some of the engravings were done much earlier than the publication date of the volume in 1786. Now, there are a couple of plates in particular that require our attention. What I was interested in doing is looking at the rectos and the versos of the copper plates. Now, on many of the copper plates, on the rectos, you have the printed image, and now on the versos, there were some extraordinary markings. In this plate in particular, what we have is a series of practice work. Now, for an engraver to learn how to engrave, they needed to use the engraving tools and a copper plate. And what you're looking at now is the verso of a copper plate filled with practice work. Bezier's studio was famous for its linear style. There's a series, a visual language that uses linear patterns to recreate form and tone. And this is an apprentice practicing those patterns on a copper plate. So what we have is a consistency in depth of line and spacing of line. This demonstrates the apprentice engraver was practicing putting pressure on a burin to gouge out these lines at a consistent depth and a consistent width. The consistent width gives you a consistent tone, and the consistent depth, again, indicates a consistent pressure for creating these patterns. In addition to straight lines, we also have hatching. One of the main aspects of a linear approach is the use of hatching to create, again, depth and tone. And here we have rectilinear areas, the one on your left, an apprentice practicing how to create hatching, repeating patterns. There's also some swirls and what could be seen as sort of curved lines and potentially sort of vegetative shapes that correspond with some of the copper plates attributable to Blake that contain similar curved lines. In other words, an apprentice practicing these curved lines by using a burin or an etching needle are evident on the rectos of these copper plates, verso, sorry. In the case of these vegetative lines, it sort of anticipates Blake's own use of interlinear vegetation, most famously in his illuminated books. And here's an example from the Bodleian's copy of Songs of Innocence, which Blake produced exactly 10 years after he finished his apprenticeship. It's probably his most accessible work. And if you're interested and need a Christmas present, the Bodleian have a wonderful edition for sale right now in the bookstore. Press play. So one of the things that Selene Technology has allowed us to do is to get information, render the information in a way that it's just impossible with the naked eye. So in addition to the squiggly lines and straight lines and hatching marks, there's also a series of semicircles, which could only have been made with a dry point compass. And John has been able to detect the shadow impressions of where the compass would have sat as Blake started to experiment with these semicircles. Why is that sort of significant? Well, we find in the finished engravings a series of swirls that were used with a dry point compass. And Blake himself, about 4 years after he completed his apprenticeship and went into business as a printmaker, uses a compass in architectural designs. And this is from 1784. And Blake's use of a compass, you can see at the top and bottom on the left-hand side. Compasses and circles also feature as visual motifs throughout Blake's works. Most famously, this is called the Ancient Days. You may be familiar with this particular image, where you have the Eurozenic god figure circumscribed by a globe of some sort, holding dividers, or most Blake scholars interpret this as the golden compass mentioned in Milton's Paradise Lost. Compasses also feature regularly in his watercolor paintings. He did 537 watercolor illustrations to Young's Night Thoughts, several of which include these compasses, as well as the illuminated book Jerusalem. His longest and most complex work in illuminated printing includes a compass as well. And most famously, this image you may be familiar with if you've been to the British Library. You have Pagliazzi's fabulous sculpture. This is in the Tate Britain at the moment. This is Newton using a compass to circumscribe an arc within a triangle. On the back of another copper plate, we notice some other incisions that were less structured, more spontaneous and perhaps playful. Now, what you're looking at here is a plate mark. And what the apprentice engraver has done is decide to put some hatching in the first O of London. To give you an idea, the size of that O is about 1.5 millimeters. So he's working at a sort of very minute scale in a very controlled way, using some form of magnification. There's also this. This is a short-shafted, heavily fletched arrow. It was made with a type of burin called a scorper that has a flat end. It's 18 millimeters long, so while you can see it with the naked eye, it's very difficult to see sort of, much of the details. Why is that important for Blake? Well, Blake loved an arrow. He loved more than arrows. In his pictorial work, as well as his poetic work, arrows feature prominently as a motif. Indeed, it's a motif that sort of reappears again and again. This is from Blake's illustrations to Milton's Paradise Lost. This is Satan meeting his son, otherwise known as Death, armed both with arrows. This is another illustration from Blake's Paradise Lost, where you have the sun with his 7 arrows defeating the rebel angels, sending them all to the fiery lake. In his Night Thoughts, we have the reappearance of the sun with his bow pulling arrows out of quivers, and then Death appears as well in the same set of illustrations, holding a short-shafted, heavily fletched arrow. Blake also engraved 43 of these illustrations. So he did 537 watercolors illustrating Young's poem, of which then he engraved 43 that were published in a doomed attempt to enter into the large illustrated book market. Sadly, the market fell through because Britain decided to go to war with Napoleon. Actually, the other way around. Napoleon declared war on Britain. And then in his poetry, there are too many examples to name, but I'm going to give you the most famous. This is the preface to Milton, the hymn now known as Jerusalem, where we have the lines, "Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire." So if we're looking at a work by Blake here, this could be the first instance of Blake using this motif around the age of 15, a motif that reappears both textually and visually throughout the rest of his life. The other motif we found on this plate was almost impossible to see, largely because the existence of what's called repouchage. Repouchage is a way that an engraver uses to correct mistakes or to amend a plate. So if something needs amending, the copper plate is flipped over and they take a small ball peen hammer and knock out the mistake. So what we have here is a tiny face engraved, incised into the back of the plate underneath the repouchage. There we go. Now this is, the scale again is minute. This is from top to bottom about 18 millimeters. What the engraver has done is he's hatched the eyes to give a sort of expressive character. And it's a face, but it's a face that I think is a doodle rather than a fully formed face. In other words, during the apprentice's long day, where he's doing these very repetitive actions of making these linear marks, there are times that clearly he needs to entertain himself, right? Keep himself. So he flips over the plates and he starts doodling. In other words, this is personal and private art that for the last 250 years, we haven't been able to access. The Selene technology now makes it possible to see this face made by an apprentice 250 years ago. If this is Blake, what you're looking at now is Blake's first portrait, albeit a crude portrait, but Blake's first portrait. Thank you very much.